When we did hear Hamid Darwish, he was still very gracious. He said, while he respects that this is a land of rights, he is very thankful and happy now to be on U.S. soil. And when talking about the people of the U.S., he said they are the greatest people in the world. So I've got with me a number of people to discuss all that's transpired here since this executive order was signed yesterday. With me now, Lynn Sweet, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times, CNN political analyst Patrick Healy, who is also the deputy director for culture at the New York Times. Also here in studio with me, criminal defense attorney and constitutional attorney Paige Pate. Good to see all. Oh, and Bob Baer's back with us as well. All right, to everyone now. So, Lynn, let me begin with you, because a lot has transpired, but then namely about Hamid Darwish and now his release. How do you expect that this might symbolize either a real problem with how this executive order is going to be carried out? You heard from the attorney there who said already it's being exercised in an arbitrary fashion, given that his family was able to get through with no problem, but that Hamid Darwish, an Iraqi national, was held up for 17 hours.
Well, one of the lessons of this episode is what happens when you issue executive orders and you haven't given guidance to the relevant agencies to know how to prioritize, to know how to carry out these orders at the various ports of entries within the United States. I think another thing to watch for, Frederica, is whether or not this is indeed extended to people who hold green cards, because right now, the thought would be, if you hold a green card, would you venture out of the United States without having written down how this executive order will be carried out in a uniform and consistent way? And if there are any emergency orders, of course, from the judicial branch that could impact on this. So I think what you're seeing today is a day of uncertainty because of the way this was rolled out. Before we even get to the significance of the policy, you see the impact of the chaotic unrolling.
The confusion. And so our Rachel Crane, who was there at JFK, she reported earlier that she had a count of upwards of 12 people who are being detained, and Hamid Darwish is one of them, the first now to be released as far as we understand. So Paige, this executive order being put into place, it being exercised, honored, utilized, whichever way you want to, classify it, is this also a case that exemplifies it is confusing right now, it will continue to be, or should this exemplify that it should not be honored as yet until everyone gets the message, or who carries it out and in what form?
Well, I think that's a big problem here. You have customs agents basically at the border, at the airport, setting immigration policy, and that makes no sense at all. What there needs to be here is some follow-through by the administration to say, okay, I'm going to have this executive order, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to follow it out. I can't believe they didn't think ahead of time that there were going to be people on the plane who had already...
Because White House counsel, right, or at least Donald Trump counsel in transition period, crafted this executive order. Right. I mean, it is extensive. I know you read it. I went through it too. That is not something you just penned overnight. No. There's a lot of legalese in it. So why wouldn't all those considerations be made before announcing it, before putting it into play?
I have no idea. I mean, the policy is clear, and I understand the policy as it's set forth in the executive order, what he's going to ban, what he's going to allow, but the implementation of that policy also has to be thought out. And in a good executive order doesn't just set policy, doesn't just set priorities, but it tells the agencies how to carry those out, and I think that's what's missing here.
And Bob, you and I were talking just before we had that live shot of Hamid Darwish, and one of the points that you were making was the message this is sending to allies, the message being sent to other nations where the U.S. certainly leans on, needs a kind of cooperation, and this can be misconstrued, if not improperly applied, to damage those kinds of relations?
Well, exactly, Fred. I mean, look at the Iraqi translators. They're working with their troops. With our troops, they're dying. There's a commitment to resettle them in the United States after
and U.S. troops still in Iraq needing to lean on, rely upon translators who are Iraqi nationals. Go ahead.
our troops don't speak Arabic. They need Iraqis. And then we have the Kurds that are doing most of the fighting, and they hold Iraqi passports. There are international flights that, that go into Kurdistan, and these people depend upon us for supplies and the rest of us, and we're just basically saying you're not allowed in our country. This is going to be completely, totally demoralizing for them, and we need them to destroy the Islamic State. So what happens with this? There's been no explanation, no coordination with the State Department. Who knows what's going on in the National Security Council, but this is ill-advised. It cannot be carried out. It cannot continue as it is.
And I mentioned CNN's Rachel Crane is there at JFK. She's on the phone with us now. So, Rachel, earlier you reported there were 12, as far as you knew, who are being detained there at JFK, and Hamid Darwish is one of them, the first to be released. Now, what more can you tell us about how people are detained, what they're experiencing, and what is the status right now?
Well, Fred, there's a small number of people that have started a protest here at JFK. As you mentioned, Hamid Darwish just released one of the 12 that has been detained here. He spoke about how he had been here detained since 6 p.m. last night. He was traveling with his wife and his 3 children. They were not detained. He was the only one of the family that was detained. But now he has been released. He actually said that he liked Donald Trump, that this is a policy. He didn't quite understand it, but he respected the policy. And he was obviously exhausted and very excited to be reunited with his family and get some sleep.
Patrick, go ahead. Sorry, Rachel.
Sorry, but we're still, Fred, we don't know anything else about the remaining 11 beyond just the detail of one of the detainees that is involved also in this lawsuit. But the remaining 10, we don't know what their nationalities are. We don't know what their visa status was. A lot of questions surrounding the details of the other 11 people that are being still held here at JFK.
And then, Rachel, if you could describe Darwish's description of what happened when he, handed over his passport. I found it difficult to hear from my end, but perhaps you had a better vantage point and could hear the process of what he encountered.
Yeah, he said that his documentation was taken away from him, that he was put into a room, sat in a chair, and that he was then moved to another room, but that he hadn't slept at all, that he was in one room, people kept coming and talking to him. But it was actually, for myself, it was a bit hard to hear those details as well, Fred. But I could hear that he was saying that he had been in a room, that he hadn't slept, and that the people were questioning him for many, many hours.
Oh, okay. And in all, about 17 hours before his release, as far as we've understood, based on him being detained as of 6 o'clock last night. Nick Robertson also with us. So, Nick, this gentleman has been a translator working with the U.S. Abroad there in Iraq. Bob underscored the importance of that kind of relationship, particularly as we continue to have U.S. military in Iraq. Iraq is one of the 7 nations. In all, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Iran are part of this executive order. What's your understanding about the reaction, the concern from many who are working in the interest of the U.S. in any or all of those nations?
We've seen over the past few years, not just the United States, but Britain as well, not be as lenient in letting in people who have put their lives on the line to support the United States or Britain in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And I have to say right now as well, in Syria too, where there are U.S. special forces on the ground in Syria, there will be people there, whether they're in local tribal militias or however they will be aligned with the U.S. forces supporting them. They also will be considering putting their lives on the line. They'll do it for their own national interests, do it for their own tribal interests, their own family interests, but also that they know that they're partnering with a force that they hope and believe supports them to the extent if the ground shifts, if ISIS, for example, takes over and comes after and threatens their families, as we've seen ISIS do time and time again. We're rounding up, for instance, not large numbers of police and their families inside Mosul as a reaction to the way that their partnership with US and Iraqi forces. If that comes into play, they want to be able to turn to the United States to look for help look for some salvation. When you're prepared to shed your own blood for someone else's country, you expect a level of support. So somebody making that consideration potentially now is going to think twice, and it plays into the ISIS propaganda as well that we haven't seen come out yet. But I think it would be expectant that ISIS will play on propaganda, saying that, you know, the United States is anti-Muslim, they're never going to look after you. We will. That sort of propaganda is going to fuel their campaign and fuel their fight. So there are many ways in which this is counterproductive, counterintuitive. And I would throw one other thing in there as well. We've heard now Iran say they're reciprocating banning Americans going to Iran for the next 90 days as well. Well, guess what? President Trump was on the phone with President Putin as the Iranians were saying that. President Trump wants to partner, he said, with Russia to tackle ISIS. If you do that in Syria, instantly, if you partner with Russia, you're partnering with Iran and with Assad. All these pieces are interconnected, and the fact that the changing landscape of how you think a partnership could work out is being impacted by a decision that you may feel was entirely disconnected from perhaps finding support from Russia to tackle ISIS. That Iran piece suddenly moves into view because Iran is a big ally of Russia in Syria right now.
So Patrick, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, just to jump on, excuse me, what Nick said was, we're talking about a lot of consequences here, and we're talking about a lot of process that essentially Donald Trump, as president, is not following standard operating procedure and thinking about the consequences of an executive order and how that will filter out to customs agents and people on airplanes. We have got to remember that is not what he ran on. He ran on making big statements and sending a big message to Americans and to the world that he was radically changing policy about border security, about who America was letting into the country,
but
how
Patrick,
they were going to be
during that
vetted.
inaugural speech, he said America first.
Absolutely, and that is his focus now. I think the point is to remember, and I interviewed him over and over and over again during the campaign, sort of the message that he wants is not about, okay, let's hold back on the executive order until we figure out how it's going to be implemented and who's going to do what when. That is not how he thinks, Fred, and you know this, and I think our other guests know this. He's not focused on that. He is, I think, to a large extent, he wants to make a big impact in ways that Americans are watching on television, seeing what's happening on airports, and hopefully, at least his supporters, he wants to think, things are changing. We're stopping some of these folks from getting into the country. That's the message that he wants to send, not, oh, I'm following all the details and doing things the usual, the usual way.
And Lynn, it seems like message received because this is the most consequential executive order, according to a lot of people that we've talked to today, who say, among the 14 executive orders that have been put into place in just 1 week of office, this is the one that is rattling most. He pledged to, put America first. He also pledged that things would be done differently, to your point, Patrick, and we're seeing that. But then, Lynn, there also seems to be, some real political capital that is being spent here at the risk of further isolating himself by going around not involving members of Congress, not being inclusive, which was the other message that he had conveyed.
Well, if I may respectfully disagree a little bit with you, Fred, and underscore a bit more of what Patrick Healy said, my guess is that if Trump says that the takeaway from today is that some people were caught in detention for a few hours because I didn't do all the rulemaking and go through the procedures, he won't, I don't think he will think that that is the minus that we may think for people who cover government as it unfolds in a usually more orderly, consistent way. So I'm reserving judgment for the moment, Fred, if there is any political damage in the short or long term as a result of this chaotic rollout. I think we will see the upshot of these series of executive actions that are being rushed. When it comes to presenting a budget to Congress that's in a few weeks, that's when I think the real fault lines, if they are there within the Republican Party, will be more obvious to us.
Okay, we're not done talking about this. We're going to take a short break. Lynn Sweet, Patrick Healy, Bob Baer, Paige Pate, Nick Robertson, thanks to all of you. Appreciate it. We'll be right back.